Winter, 1944. The Apennine Mountains. This is not the Italy of postcards. This is a place of granite, ice, and a wind that comes from a place of pure malice. For the Precinis of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, this was another planet. A man from the warm coasts of Rio or the plains of Pernambuco was now trying to survive at 3,000 feet in 20 degrees below zero. On this battlefield, the true enemy was not the man in the gray uniform, hidden in a bunker. The true enemy was the thermometer. At 20 degrees below zero, the world behaves differently. Steel does not behave like steel. It becomes brittle. It shrinks. It lies. And the one thing that connects a soldier to his life, his only defense, his rifle begins to fail. The Brazilians were armed with beautiful pieces of American engineering. The M1 Garand, the Browning automatic rifle, the Thompson submachine gun. These were arguably the best weapons of the war, but they had one single devastating weakness. They had to be clean, and they had to be lubricated. And the lubricant, the standard issue U.S. Army gun oil, was failing. It was specification number 2 to 109, a general-purpose lubricating oil. It was not designed for this. It was designed for the mud of France, the deserts of Africa, the jungles of the Pacific. It was not designed for the frozen peaks of the high up at 20, 25, 30 degrees below zero. The oil stopped being a lubricant. It became an adhesive. It congealed. It turned into a thick, black, molasses-like tar. Imagine the moment. A sentry, his face numb, his feet 2 blocks of dead wood inside his boots, sees a movement in the snow. A German patrol. Shadows in the pre-dawn light. He raises he aligns the sight. He squeezes the trigger, and ... click, a dead, metallic sound. The firing pin, clogged with frozen, gummy grease, has moved too slowly. It failed to strike the primer, or worse, the first shot fires, the bang echoing flat in the dead, cold air. But the mechanism, choked with that icy sludge, fails to cycle. The bolt moves back in a sick, sluggish motion, and stops, frozen open, a spent cartridge jammed in the chamber. The soldier now holds a 7-pound, single-shot club in a world of machine guns. It was a death sentence. This was the nightmare scenario, and it was happening all across the front. Soldiers were being found frozen to death in their foxholes, their rifles jammed, their hands still trying to work the bolts. The doctrine was failing. The manuals that said to liberally apply oil were actively killing them. This is the problem facing a single squad. They are holding a critical observation post, a ruined stone shepherd's hut on an exposed ridge. And their squad leader, a sergeant we will call Silva, knows this problem better than anyone. Sergeant Silva was not an engineer. He was not a scientist. He was a man from the green valleys of Minas Gerais. He was a fazendero, a farmer. He knew sugarcane. He knew the alambique, the simple copper still. Ik know cachaça, aha. And he had a secret weapon. In his pack, and in the pack of every man in his squad, was a small, government tissue flask. It was their ration, not of rum, like the British, not whiskey, like the Americans, but pure, fire-in-the-belly Brazilian Cachaça. This was not just alcohol taizuazome. It was the sun. It was a liquid memory of warmth, of laughter, of a life without snow. It was also, officially, listed as medicine, a desinfetante, something to clean a wound, or to give to a man in shock. But mostly, it was morale. It was the one thing that could bring a frozen man back to life. It was precious. It was liquid gold. Silva's squad is tasked with a critical mission. A reconnaissance in force at 0400. They have to move silently, in the darkest, coldest part of the night. Cross 500 meters of terra iningum, no man's land, and ambush a German machine gun nest that has been terrorizing their sector. Their lives, and the success of a larger attack, planned for dawn, depend on their weapons working. First time, every time. Hours before they move out, Silva does his inspection. The air is so cold it hurts to breathe. By the light of a single, shielded candle in their ruined hut, he pulls the bolt on his bar. It doesn't slide. It drags like a stick through wet cement. He strips the weapon. The oil inside is no longer oil. It is black axle grease. He checks his corporal's rifle. The same. He checks the Thompson. The same. Every single weapon in his squad is compromised. They are, functionally, a patrol of men with clubs. The official doctrine had failed them. The manual was a lie. Silva looked at the useless, gummy oil. He looked at his own precious flask of cachaça. He unscrewed the cap. The smell, sharp, grassy, sweet, the smell of home. But he also smelled something else. Alcohol. Pure, high-proof, unaged sugarcane alcohol. And in his mind, the farmer and the sergeant merged. What cuts grease? Alcohol. What doesn't freeze? Alcoa. What is the only true solvent they have in this entire godforsaken mountain? He made the call. It was an order that, to his men, must have sounded like pure madness. It was sacrilege. Get your cachaça, he whispered, his voice rough. All of it? We're not drinking it. We're cleaning our guns. There was, for a long second, a profound, disbelieving silence in the ruined hut. The men just stared at their sergeant. This was not a request. It was an order. In order to take the single most precious thing they possessed, their last bottle of sun, their 80-proof connection to home, and pour it onto cold, unfeeling steel. It was blasphemy. It was like ordering a man to burn his last letter from his wife just to get a few seconds of warmth. Every man in that squad, his hands shaking from the cold, his stomach empty, was thinking the same thing. Anything but that. One of the men, a younger corporal, probably voiced it. Mas, sargento, é a cachaça. Ah, é para emergência. But, sergeant, it's the cachaça. It's for emergencies. Silva's eyes, in the flickering candlelight, were hard. Isto é a emergência. This is the emergency. We walk out that door with useless rifles. We are dead. Your emergencia will be a German bayonet in your gut. Now, strip your weapons. Todos eles. Then wait. He popped the trigger guard on his own bar, the heavy mechanism clunking onto a dirty rag. He unscrewed his own flask. The sharp, grassy, sweet smell of home filled the tiny, cold space. And with a grimace, he poured a small, clear splash of the precious liquid onto his bolt. The men watched, horrified, and then they obeyed. One by one, flasks were opened. Rags were pulled from rucksacks. The meticulous, agonizing process began. In the freezing, almost dark hut, 10 men with numb, clumsy fingers began to field-strip their weapons. They pulled out the bolts, the trigger assemblies, the firing pins. Their hands were shaking so badly from the cold they could barely hold the small pins and springs. They were using their life-saving warmth, their liquid courage, to clean. The irony was brutal. But then, a strange magic began to happen. Silva, the fazendero, knew what he was doing. He wasn't just a farmer. He was a man who understood the alembic, the still. He knew that cachaça wasn't just a drink. He knew that the first part of the distillation, the cachaça de cabica, the head of the run, was so high in alcohol and other compounds that it was a powerful industrial-grade solvent. It was the stuff they used to clean the still itself. And this ration, T's military-grade aguardiente, was very, very strong. The men would pour a tiny capful onto their rags. The moment the clear liquid touched the black, gummy, congealed U.S. Army oil, the grease dissolved. It melted Hawaii. It ran off the metal in black, dirty rivers. The alcohol was cutting the petroleum-based sludge like acid. It was a chemical miracle. The soldiers, who had been scrubbing uselessly at this frozen tar for weeks, now watched as it simply vanished under a splash of their drinking ration. They worked in a focused, awestruck silence. They rubbed down every moving part, the bolts, the slides, the firing pin channels, In 10 minutes, the weapons were unrecognizable. The metal was no longer black and sticky. It was bare, raw, and spotlessly clean. Silva picked up his bar's bolt. It was so clean, it almost squeaked. He worked the mechanism. It was fast. It was light. He had solved the problem. The grease was gone. But he had also just created a new one, a potentially fatal one. He held the bolt in his hand. It was too clean. It was dry. He was a sergeant. He was a mechanic in his own right. He knew that firing a weapon with bare, dry, supercooled metal sliding against more bare, dry, supercooled metal was also a disaster. The friction would be enormous. The weapon would work, yes, but it would grind, it would squeal, and in the dead silence of a 0400 ambush, that metallic shriek of dry steel on steel would be as loud as a gunshot. It would give away their position before they fired a single shot. And worse, the intense friction could cause the parts to heat rapidly, expand, and then seize a friction weld that would lock the gun solid just as effectively as the frozen oil had. The men looked at him, their faces hopeful. The guns were clean. They started to reassemble. "Spare 'em," Silva commanded. "Wait. It's not ready. It's dry." The corporal looked confused. "Maz, Sargento ... ... What do we use? Any oil we put on will freeze again." Silva looked at the flask in his hand. He swirled the small amount of cachaça left inside. He was a fazendeiro. He knew that cachaça was not just pure ethanol. The American manual was a lie because it gave them a lubricant that froze. But the men's assumption was also wrong. Cachaça was not just an antifreeze. He knew, from his work at the still, that cachaça real pot-stilled cachaça contained other things. It was a complex spirit. It contained water, yes, which was bad, but it also contained trace amounts of outras alcus, higher alcas, and oleos fusil and fusil oils. In the commercial distilling world, these were impurities, the things you tried to filter out. But to a farmer in Minas, they were part of the flavor, the body of the spirit, and they had a much lower freezing point than water or petroleum. This was the hack. This was the true, genius-level jitnyo. It wasn't just about cleaning. It was about replacing. "Get your rags," Silva ordered again. "Just make them damp, not wet. Just a little so wet them." He poured a tiny splash onto a clean patch of his rag. He let the harsh, volatile alcohol-head evaporate for a second in the freezing air, leaving behind a slightly slick, almost imperceptibly oily film. This was what he was after. The glycerina, the fusel oils, the soul of the spirit. "Now," he said, "wipe the bolt. Wipe the slide. Just the parts that move. Uma camada fina. A thin layer. Not enough to be wet. Just enough to be slick." The men, now completely in awe of their sergeant, did exactly as he commanded. They relubricated their weapons, not with U.S. Army oil, but with the microscopic, freeze-resistant trace oils from their own sugarcane alcohol. Silva reassembled his bar. He worked the bolt. It moved with a sound he hadn't heard in months. It was not the squelch of thick grease. It was not the scream of dry steel. It was a smooth, fast, oiled click-clack. It was the sound of a living, breathing, perfect weapon. He looked at his men, their faces, for the first time in weeks, showing a grim, cold confidence. They were no longer a squad of club-wielding farmers. At 0400, the door of the ruined hut opened. It didn't open with a creak. It had been oiled, not with 2 to 109, but with the same cachaça film. A silent push. 10 shadows detached themselves from the deeper blackness of the ruin and melted into the pre-dawn light. This was the dead hour, the coldest, darkest, most soul-crushing part of the night. The temperature was at its absolute low, perhaps 30 degrees below zero. The air was so cold it felt like breathing microscopic needles. The snow, frozen solid, crunched under their boots with a sound that, to Sergeant Silva, seemed as loud as a cannon. They moved in single file, 10 meters apart, ghosts in the dark. Their objective, the German MG-42 nest, was 500 meters away, across an open stretch of Tekajininge. This was a landscape of shattered trees, frozen shell craters, and the dark, unmoving shapes of men who had failed this exact same walk. Every shadow was a landmine. Every gust of wind was a German whisper. The tension was unbearable. Silva was at the front. His head was on a swivel. He was listening. He was listening not just for the enemy, but for his own men. He was listening for the click-clack of a rifle bolt being worked in panic. He was listening for the clang of a weapon dropped by numb hands. He heard nothing, only the crunch, crunch, crunch of their boots on the hard snow, a sound they tried to muffle, stepping heel to toe, a hunter's walk. Halfway across, the man behind him, the young corporal, stumbled. He fell to one knee. His M1 Garand, held in a death grip, swung out and hit a jagged, ice-covered rock. It was a dull, heavy, muffled sound, not the sharp, high-pitched clang of dry steel on stone. Silva froze. He turned, his heart in his throat. The corporal was frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror, waiting for the entire German army to open up on them. Silence. Nothing. The sound was so dull, so dead, it hadn't carried. The cachaça film had done more than lubricate. It had dampened the very resonance of the metal. Silva looked at the corporal, put a finger to his lips, and gave the signal to move on. The corporal got to his feet, his breathing ragged, but his confidence strangely higher. The hack was working. They reached the final approach, a low ridge, 75 meters from the German position. They crawled the last few meters on their bellies, the frozen snow biting into their uniforms. Silva raised his binoculars. He could see it. It wasn't a bunker. It was a ninho, a nest, a dugout built into the side of a small rise, reinforced with logs and sandbags. He could see the black, menacing snout of the Ladinia pointing out. He could see faint wisps of steam. They were awake. He saw a silhouette, a German sentry, stamping his feet, blowing into his hands. There were 3 of them inside, waiting for the 0500 shift change, probably dreaming of hot coffee. Silva's squad fanned out beside him in the snow. They were a perfect, silent half-moon of death. The barman set up his bipod, pushing it into a snowdrift. The 2 Thompson gunners lay flat. The Garand rifles found their targets. Silva himself was on the bar, the squad's base of fire. He whispered his orders. Browning. No sentinela. Thompson 1. Na entrada Thompson 2. Barredura en resto. No niño. He was pointing. Bar on the sentry. Thompson 1 on the doorway. Thompson 2. Sweep. Everyone else fire into the nest itself. This was the moment. The culmination of all of it. The cold, the fear, the broken doctrine, the sacrilege of the Cachaça. Their lives depended not on their courage, but on a farmer's knowledge of fusel oils. Silva took a slow, steady breath, the air burning his lungs. He put his finger on the cold, unforgiving trigger of his bar. He aligned his sights on the sentry, a dark shape against the snow. He exhaled, and he squeezed. There was no click, there was no thud. There was only the pat. A single, perfect, ear-splitting, violent explosion. The sound of a weapon working at 100% efficiency. The shot was so clean, so fast, the frozen, dry air itself seemed to shatter. The German sentry didn't fall. He simply ceased to exist, thrown backward into the darkness. And before that first echo had even died, Sergeant Silva did not have to give a second order. His squad opened up. It was not the click, bang, click jam of a frozen, desperate unit. It was a storm. It was the smooth, rhythmic thump 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 of the bar firing in perfect 3-round bursts. It was the terrifying zipper-like brrrap of the Thompson submachine guns, cycling flawlessly. It was the hard, methodical bang-ching of the M1 Garands, the empty clips singing out into the cold night air as they were ejected, followed by the immediate, perfect clack of a new clip being chambered. The sound was deafening. It was a symphony of perfectly functioning machinery. The Cachaça-coiled weapons were not just working. They were singing. They were cycling faster, cleaner, and harder than they had any right to. The fusel oils, now heated by the first shots, were performing perfectly, lubricating the metal, preventing efficiencies, while the alcohol base had long since evaporated, leaving no water to freeze. For the Germans in the nest, the world ended in 10 seconds. They were asleep or half asleep. They woke to the sound of their sentry being vaporized. Before they could even grab their own rifles, their Loginson bag nest was being torn apart by a concentrated, overwhelming storm of .30 caliber and .45 caliber rounds. The Brazilians poured hundreds of rounds into the position. The log walls splintered. The sandbags erupted. The Ladinia, the terror of the sector, never even fired a shot. Then, as suddenly as it began, Silva yelled, "Cessa fogo! Ceasefire! Silence!" A profound, ringing, chemical silence. The smell of hot metal and gunpowder was sharp in the frozen air. There was no movement from the German nest, only a dark, smoking ruin. The mission was over. The ambush was perfect. Silva and his men didn't celebrate. They were professionals. They were ghosts. "Recure," Silva whispered. "Withdraw!" They slid backward into the darkness, moving fast, moving quiet. They crossed the 500 meters of no man's land in half the time it took them to come. When they tumbled back into their own lines, back into their ruined hut, the sky in the east was just beginning to turn a pale, sick gray. The men sat in silence, their breathing ragged, the adrenaline fading, leaving a deep, bone-aching cold. They began to field strip their weapons again, right there, as was procedure. Silva picked up his barbolt. It was hot to the touch. It was still slick. It was perfect. He looked at his men. They looked at him. No one spoke. They didn't have to. They had just walked into the heart of the ice, into the very teeth of the winter, and they had won. They hadn't just beaten the Germans. They had beaten the cold, and they had done it. with a bottle of booze. When the full light of dawn finally broke, a Brazilian lieutenant, the one who had authorized the patrol, made his way to Silva's position. He looked out across the 500 meters of snow. Through his binoculars, he could see the German nest. It was dark. It was silent. It was clearly, catastrophically destroyed. He lowered his binoculars, a look of profound respect on his face. He had sent 10 men on a suicide mission, and all 10 had returned without a scratch. Sergeant 2, the lieutenant said, his voice heavy with relief. Report Silva, who was probably cleaning his bar again, this time for inspection, simply looked up. Patrulha concluída, meu tenente. Ninho de metralhadora neutralizado. Sem baixas. Patrol complete, lieutenant. Machine gun nest neutralized, no casualties. The lieutenant pressed. How? The first platoon tried that same approach last week and were cut to pieces. Their weapons all jammed. How did you... He didn't need to finish the question. He was asking about the cold. Silva looked at his squad, who were all busy cleaning their weapons, their faces blank. He looked back at the lieutenant. What could he possibly say? What was the official answer? He couldn't say, Tenant, nós cometemos ato que é provavelmente uma ofensa de corte marcial. Desobedecemos os regulamentos de manutenção de armas e usamos nossa ração médica de álcool como solvente industrial. Lieutenant, we committed what is likely a court-martial offense, disobeyed weapons, maintenance regulations, and used our medical alcohol ration as an industrial solvent. He couldn't say, eu forcei meus homens a desistir da única coisa que os mantinha sãos. Para que pudéssemos criar lubrificante caseiro à base de óleo fusel, it forced my men to give up the one thing keeping them sane, so we could create a homemade lubricant from fusel oils. That was not a report. That was a confession. It was unreportable. The hack, by its very nature, had to remain a secret. It was too unorthodox. It was too Brazilian. It was, in a word, verg on HOSO ... embarrassing. It implied that their official billion-dollar Allied supply chain had failed. It implied that a bottle of booze was a better piece of military technology than the entire U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. And you just didn't say that. So, Sergeant Silva gave the only answer a good NCO can give. He shrugged. Nós limpamos nossas armas, tenente. Muito bem. Os homens foram rápidos. E Deus estava conosco. We cleaned our weapons, Lieutenant. Very well. The men were fast. And God was with us. The lieutenant, hearing the simple, devout, and utterly uninformative answer, knew he was being managed. He knew there was a deeper story, but he also knew that the German gun was silent. He knew his men could now advance. He looked at Silva, nodded slowly, and made a decision. He would not ask again. The how didn't matter. The result was all that mattered. Bom trabalho, sargento. Reside in walker away. And so, the Cachaça hack became a ghost. It became a closely guarded squad. Secret, it was their advantage, their jitnyo. It wasn't written down, it wasn't shared with other platoons. It was a private piece of battlefield magic, and it highlights the fundamental cultural difference that made the FEB so unique. Think about it. An American sergeant, faced with the same problem, would have demanded the right equipment. He would have filed a report. This 2-to-109 oil is unacceptable. We need proper low-temperature lubricant, or my men cannot fight. He would have trusted the system to provide a solution. A German sergeant, a veteran of the Eastern Front, would have already had the right equipment. He would have had Waffenol, the correct winter-grade weapon oil, because the German doctrine was built on precision and experience. The plan would have provided. The Brazilian sergeant, Silva, had a different set of instructions. His instructions were cultural. The manual is a suggestion. The system will probably fail. The plan is just a starting point. You must solve it. Use your brain. Use what you have. The individual provides. Silva looked at the resources available. He had guns. He had rags. He had ... Cachaça. In his mind, the Cachaça was not a morale ration that was just a label. It was a tool. It was a solvent. It was an antifreeze. It was a lubricant. He saw its total utility, not its labeled utility. This was a level of creative problem-solving that the other armies simply weren't wired for. The very absurdity of the hack was what protected it. It hid in plain sight. If Silva's men had been caught, what would the charge be? Soldier, you are accused of overcleaning your weapon, of using an unauthorized ... spirit. It was too strange to be a crime. It sounded like a joke. The Brazilians. Oh, they're so crazy. They clean their guns with booze. But the joke was on everyone else. The drunken rifles were the only ones on the entire front that were guaranteed to fire. But this hack had a cost. A real human cost. It was not a free trick. Every time Silva's squad prepared for a night patrol, they had to make a choice. The cachaça was their only comfort. It was the one thing that could drive the bone-deep cold from their bodies. It was the one thing that could give a terrified man the courage to step out into the darkness. And Silva was ordering them to sacrifice it, to pour their courage onto a rag, all for the chance that their weapon would work. This adds a layer of profound grit to the story. They were not just cleaning their guns. They were sacrificing their own morale for the sake of their collective survival. They were giving up their spirit to make their steel come alive. And every time they did it, it was a test of faith. Faith in their sergeant, faith in his strange farmer's wisdom, and faith in a hack that no one else in the world knew. And so, this became their ritual, a quiet, almost religious ceremony of sacrifice and chemistry performed in the dark, far from the eyes of officers. While other squads were praying their guns wouldn't jam, Silva's squad was ensuring it. They became the ghost patrol, the men who could move in the deepest cold, the men whose rifles always fired. They were assigned the most dangerous missions, the 4 a.m. ambush, the reconnaissance patrols in the middle of blizzards. Because the command, even if they didn't know the how, couldn't deny the results. Silva's squad had a 100% success rate. They became a quiet legend. Then, the spring of 1945 came. The war, which had been a static, frozen nightmare, suddenly broke open. The snows melted. The Gothic line, that fortress of ice and rock, shattered. The fighting spilled down into the Po Valley, a flat, open expanse. And just like that, the temperature rose. The brutal sub-zero cold was replaced by a mild Italian spring, and as instantly as the problem had appeared, it vanished. The U.S. Army's standard issue 2-109 gun oil, which had been a deadly gummy tar at 30 below zero, was now, at 50 degrees above, a perfectly serviceable lubricant. The Cachaça hack, that brilliant, desperate, and sacrilegious solution, was no longer necessary. The problem it solved was gone. It was a perfect key for an impossible lock. And now, the lock had simply melted away. Just a few weeks later, on May 2nd, 1945, the German forces in Italy surrendered. The war was over. The guns fell silent. Silva's squad, like all the other Prasinas, put down their weapons, this time for good. They cleaned them one last time, probably using the correct U.S. Army oil, their secret hack, already becoming a memory. There was no formal recognition. There was no medal for creative field lubrication. How could there be? The hack was never reported. It was an invisible act of defiance. It existed only in the shared memory of the 10 men who had survived because of it. It was their secret. When the logisticians and the Be-the-Boo captains took over in the aftermath, they would have seen nothing out of the ordinary. Just a squad with an unusually clean service record and a strangely low consumption of their alcohol ration. And what of Sergeant Silva, the fazendero who had become a battlefield chemist? Like all the other Prasinas, he waited for the ship to take him home. He landed in Rio, handed in his bar, his helmet, his gear. He received his discharge papers and a handshake. It was no longer Sargento. He was just Silva again. He didn't write a book. He didn't give lectures at the military academy on the properties of fusel oils in sub-zero conditions. He simply went home. He went back to the green, rolling hills of Minas. He went back to his alambak. He went back to the smell of fermenting sugarcane, to the heat of the copper still, to the life he had known before the ice. He lived a long, quiet, anonymous life. His neighbors knew him as a good farmer, a hard worker, a man who made a particularly strong and clean cachaça. He probably told stories to his children and grandchildren, stories of a strange, cold, upside-down world where the sun never shone and the air hurt your face. He probably told them about the Lardinia, the German gun, and maybe, just maybe, late at night, after a small glass of his own product, he might have told his sons the real story. He might have told them with a small, grim smile, "You know, This very stuff, this gid Cachaça, it saved my life. It saved my whole squad. And his sons would have laughed, thinking the old man was being metaphorical, thinking he was talking about the spirit of the drink, the courage it gave him. They would have no way of knowing he was being literal. They wouldn't know that for one desperate, frozen winter. Their father's knowledge of distilling was more important than his knowledge of soldiering. They wouldn't know that the soul of this spirit had literally kept the soul of his rifle alive. Silva's name is not on any monument. His hack is not in any manual. It was a perfect, contained, brilliant act of giardino. It was a story of sacrifice, of a squad that gave up its only comfort to ensure its own survival. It's the story of a leader who saw a problem not through the eyes of a soldier, but through the eyes of a farmer. He proved that sometimes the answer to a high-tech, modern, military problem isn't a high-tech solution. Sometimes it's just a bottle of booze and the wisdom to know how to use it.